Hello, this is my totally made up two-step process to break down references in order to learn how to draw from memory. So once I have my reference, I'm just going to start tracing over the lines that I'm seeing. So a line down the middle of the face, a line for the eyes, a line for the nose, and one for the mouth and for the chin. And then after that, I'm just going to look at what I have without the reference photo underneath, and then I'm going to try to think about sort of the relative distance between each line. So you can kind of see how the eye line is somewhat in the middle of the face, a little bit higher if it's maybe an adult, maybe a little lower if it's a child. And I also did notice that when the face is looking straight at the camera, the nose ends up being just about where the circle ends. And then the lips are half the distance between the nose and the chin. And then my second step in breaking down these references is trying to figure out where the planes of the face are. I think it depends on the specific reference and the type of facial structure that the reference has, but in general, the facial structure is kind of the same across references. This is kind of where it gets difficult, at least, because you have to think of the face in a sort of 3D setting. For instance, the eyes are more sunken in than the nose might be, so that's kind of where you want to draw those lines, where you'll mostly see shadows. So don't think of the face as a soft surface. I would say to think of it as a very angled object. Even the cheeks are angled, like the cheekbones and the plane of the cheek should be in different sections because the light hits the cheekbone more than it does the side of your face, in the instance that the light is at the top. You can see how I found a new reference, but I made sure to look for one that gives me a different angle of the head, just because I think it's better to get a 3D mental model of how the head looks like when it moves. And then I could kind of build my mental library and eventually be able to draw from memory without references. Little bit of a side tangent, but I think what really helps me is drawing things mostly with straight lines. So you can draw the circle to start off the head, you can draw the ear with curved lines, but using straight lines, you can really isolate the shapes of the face rather than getting too distracted with the little tiny curves and the little details that can obviously be added after you get the basic structure underneath the face. And now that I'm doing my third reference, I notice that the face follows parallel lines. Like for instance, if you were to think of the face as a cylinder, the features have to follow parallel lines. You can kind of see it on the reference right here, where the line for the eyes is parallel to the curve of the line for the nose, and everything sort of matches up. And so I think that creating this sort of mental map for facial features is going to help once we don't have any references to look at. Same step 2 here, I'm just going to be mapping out the planes of the face. Alright, so now that I'm done with the studying, I'm gonna write just a few notes that really stuck out to me for this one practice. And this is probably the most boring part of it, but this is where you kind of solidify all that information. And I did note that when I was drawing the planes of the face, I was kind of thinking of a sort of Batman mask. Okay, so now it's time to take what I learned and apply it without looking at the references. Obviously, you can just go back up to where you drew the references and just check your work, but the whole point of this is to learn how to draw without a reference. So using the same steps that I used when tracing the references, I tried to do these entirely from memory. I messed up a couple times, but that's just kind of the process here. You really want this to be challenging, and the more challenging this is, the better it's going to be for your art progress. So I ended up drawing 3 practice heads, each with the 2 steps that we use on the references. The first is the mapping of the features, and the second would be mapping out the planes of the face. Now, I spent about an hour doing all 6 of these heads. You don't have to spend that amount of time if you don't have it, but it does mean that you can get really good practice in about 20 minutes. So if you spent 5 minutes breaking down a reference and 15 minutes drawing it from memory, that's a perfect way to practice. And remember that the whole point of this is to be a little bit frustrated. The more frustrated you are and the more problem solving you do, the better you're able to draw without reference later on.